Hi all. This module focuses on research methods that scholars use to study communication in small groups. Even if you're not someone who will be doing academic research on small groups, it's really useful to understand what kind of research design options are available and why researchers make the choices that they do when studying groups. We'll be reading research articles as part of this course, so the material this week helps prepare you for that. Additionally, though, the readings this week by talking about research, help to point out how complex it is to really try to study groups. And that complexity has real practical implications for people like us who are trying to work in or lead teams. So let's start by thinking about some of the things we know about groups already. First, we know about the characteristics of what makes people into a group. We know that people in a group are interdependent, and that they have some things that bind them together, like a shared goal, some type of group structure, and a shared identity, right? These are the defining characteristics of a group. And these things that are shared in a group and the interdependence, they make a difference in how people will act. So people act differently in groups than they would if they were just by themselves, right? That's just part of what happens in groups. We know that. When we're part of a group, we communicate in specific ways that make sense for the group, that are appropriate. Second, we know that how groups communicate can depend a lot on who's in the group in the first place. So for example, if there are two groups doing the same task, but one is made up of people who are all really similar, and another is made up of people where there's a lot of variety in members' age, gender, culture, race, and so on, these groups are likely to communicate very differently from each other. You can think about your own experience when you've had really successful group interactions or really frustrating group interactions. Sometimes the part of what makes a difference is just who's there in the group in the first place, right? Third, we know that groups exist within specific contexts, and we'll learn more about context in the upcoming weeks, but even at this point in the course, we can understand that groups that are in the context of playing sports on a competitive, like professional level are really different than groups who are in the context of playing sports in a recreational community level, like kind of pickup games, right? And we know that even in work teams, those that exist in innovative, fast-paced global companies that use a lot of virtual tools, that's going to be really different from a team that's part of a small, local nonprofit organization. So the context makes a big difference in what happens in the group and how the group sort of functions. Fourth, we know that when groups do things together, when they conduct activity, when they communicate and act in some way, that these actions can lead to specific outcomes. So when groups do things like deepen their relationships or engage in conflict or make decisions, that these are communication practices that can lead to specific outcomes. So none of these, these are four things that we know about groups, and none of them completely control what a group is going to do or how members will communicate, but they all have some kind of influence. So when we're studying groups, it can be kind of complicated. At the same time, though, groups are kind of a microcosm of society, so studying groups can tell us a lot about the communication and social life broadly, more than just studying individuals, because as we've talked about, we are all part of lots of groups, right? Groups are how we live our lives for many of us. So we're thinking about what are the methods that scholars use to study these different aspects of groups. A lot of small group research uses quantitative research methods. So some of this work looks at inputs and the outcomes of groups. So for example, there's been a lot of research that has examined how having diverse group members, that's kind of an input, who's in the room, right? How that's related to the quality of the group decisions, right? And so then that research would compare, like I was talking about earlier, these kind of groups with a really diverse membership versus groups that are more kind of homogenous, that everybody is pretty much the same, and look at how they perform on a particular task. Other research has examined things like online groups and compared them to in-person groups to see what influence technology has on group outcomes. And outcomes include things like how long it takes a group to complete the task, the quality of the work, member satisfaction, so on and so forth. So a lot of this research that does sort of input and outcomes, uses laboratory experiments, kind of like social psychologists. And this allows researchers to make sure groups are doing the same sort of task and have the same conditions, right? Because then you can do fair comparisons between the groups and control some of the other variables that might influence how groups function, right? So this helps make the research more valid in terms of the quantitative social scientific work that it's doing. And it allows researchers to control different variables and draw, solid conclusions from comparing the groups. So of course there's limitations to doing laboratory research, right? Research in a lab, maybe you get college students and they do this task and you study them. Or, sometimes this kind of research might do kind of field research and study teams that are in actual organizations or in real life contexts, but still trying to control as much as they could. So looking at inputs and outcomes is useful, right? It helps us understand the conditions where we can expect certain outcomes to be more likely, like groups are more likely to make good decisions if they have these particular things that they do. But it's also the kind of work that is done to test this stuff has some limitations because it's pretty separated from real life, real world experiences. And so one of the criticisms of this kind of work is that it doesn't look closely enough at the actual group communication processes. Remember, we talked about how meaning is made through interaction. So if we really want to understand meaning, we should look at the actual interaction. But historically, group research has sort of looked at what goes into the group, what comes out of the group, and treat the group itself sort of like a black box, right? So scholars who focus on interaction and communication have been kind of critical of that approach. And we see some of that in our reading for today. So group scholars who look at interaction and communication can use some different methods. Some use quantitative methods like content analysis, where they might count things like how many questions do group members ask, how many times do interruptions happen, how many different ideas are groups considering when they're trying to solve a problem, how many different group members talk, and who are those people, and so on and so forth. So this kind of work gives a more detailed picture of how groups function, like what the actual interaction is like. And this work has been really helpful in providing models for group decision-making, leadership, inclusion, and change management. But there's also a lot of qualitative methods that scholars have used to study groups, like doing long-term case studies of specific groups or interviewing people about their experiences in groups. And this kind of qualitative research is really good for giving deeper knowledge about communication practices and the sort of meanings of interactions that make up group life. Qualitative work can highlight specific contexts and look at how aspects of the context really shape the group communication, and it can provide a lot of detail, right? And so this qualitative work has helped us understand things like identity and meaning making and group processes, and look really closely at the communication involved in particularly difficult types of conversations. So this kind of rich analysis has been very important in group research, and we'll see examples of different qualitative studies as we go through this course. Of course, all research has limitations, right? So I think it's important to read studies that use different kinds of methods because it can help us learn more about groups from a wide variety of angles. In some ways, the qualitative work can be limited because it sheds light on specific groups, right? Just it looks deep at specific things rather than making broader, generalizable claims about all groups. And the quantitative studies can make well-supported claims about cause and effect, but they miss a lot of the complexity, right? So it's a matter of like big picture versus like really deep knowledge of specifics. So my hope is that the material in this module helps you develop knowledge about what kinds of choices researchers are making when studying groups. And I also hope it helps prepare you for reading the different kinds of studies that we will have in this course. Taken together, these studies can have practical implications for how you act as a group member and how you manage and lead teams that you're part of. Okay, that's it for now. Please reach out with questions or thoughts that you have about group research, and I look forward to reading your reflections this week.